A black flight attendant, doing her job with pride, suddenly becomes the target of a white pilot's insults. He tries to humiliate her, even kick her off the flight. But there's one thing he doesn't know. The airline's owner, a black man, is sitting quietly on that same plane, watching every second of this ugly scene. The flight attendant was no stranger to hard work. She had built her career on professionalism, dedication, and resilience in the face of adversity. But on this day, she was blindsided by an encounter she couldn't have prepared for. The pilot, a man whose demeanor screamed entitlement, began his assault with subtle jabs. His tone was condescending, his words dripping with disdain, as he questioned her qualifications and capabilities in front of the crew. The tension in the air was palpable. Other flight attendants and crew members exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to intervene. It was the unspoken code: don't challenge authority, especially not in such a volatile setting. The flight attendant stood frozen, her face calm but her heart racing. She knew she had to tread carefully. A single word of defense could escalate the situation, but silence felt like submission. It was a lose-lose situation. The pilot's audacity grew. He escalated his insults, no longer bothering to veil them. He pointed out irrelevant faults, accused her of incompetence, and even suggested she step aside and let someone more suitable take her place. His words echoed loudly in the cabin, and a few passengers nearby started to notice the commotion. Some looked shocked, others avoided eye contact, pretending not to see the unfolding drama. As the pilot called for her removal, the flight attendant felt a wave of anger and humiliation washing over her. She couldn't understand how someone in such a respected position could behave so brazenly, so hatefully. This wasn't just a power trip, it was blatant racism, and everyone could see it. But the power dynamic was glaringly clear. She was an employee, and he was her superior. How could she stand up to him without risking her job? The passengers were now whispering among themselves, their curiosity piqued. Some were visibly uncomfortable, while others seemed to wait in anticipation for what would happen next. The other crew members stayed silent, not wanting to jeopardize their own positions. The atmosphere on the plane had shifted from a routine boarding process to an unsettling spectacle. Unbeknownst to anyone, one passenger was watching this unfold with a very different perspective. Sitting quietly near the back of the plane was the airline's owner, a man who had built his business from the ground up, defying countless odds. He was a black man who had faced his share of prejudice and knew exactly what the flight attendant was going through. At first, he remained silent, observing how the situation played out. His heart ached for the young woman who was trying so desperately to maintain her composure. The pilot, completely unaware of who was on board, continued his tirade. He was confident his actions would go unchecked, that his position would shield him from any consequences. But the owner had seen enough. He wasn't just witnessing a case of disrespect, this was a moment of outright injustice, and he knew he couldn't stay silent. The seeds of a reckoning were being sown. As the scene unfolded, the cabin was filled with an uneasy silence, broken only by the pilot's harsh words. The flight attendant, visibly holding back tears, maintained her professionalism, even as she became the target of unwarranted ridicule. She knew any reaction could be used against her, yet her silence only seemed to embolden the pilot. He smirked, turning to the crew for validation, but no one dared to meet his gaze. His authority had created an invisible barrier that silenced everyone. Fear trumped morality. Passengers began to take notice. Some were whispering among themselves, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. A few passengers craned their necks, trying to get a better view, while others buried themselves in their phones, pretending not to notice. This wasn't just another awkward pre-flight delay, it was something far uglier. The flight attendant felt the weight of every eye on her. Her mind raced with questions. Should she defend herself? Should she report him later? But who would believe her? He was the pilot, the face of authority on the plane, while she was just an employee. It wasn't just her job on the line, it was her dignity. The pilot, intoxicated by his perceived power, decided to escalate. He turned to a supervisor, loudly demanding that the flight attendant be replaced. "She's not fit for this role," he barked, loud enough for everyone to hear. The supervisor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but unsure how to respond. The pilot's confidence was unshaken. He believed he could get away with anything. Unbeknownst to him, a silent observer sat just a few rows away. The airline's owner, a black man, watched the scene unfold with a calm yet piercing intensity. At first glance, no one would have guessed his identity. Dressed casually and keeping a low profile, he looked like any other passenger. But inside, he was seething. He had built this airline with a vision of equality and opportunity, and here, in front of him, was an affront to everything he stood for. The owner resisted the urge to intervene immediately. He wanted to see how far the pilot would take this and how the crew and passengers would respond. It wasn't just about one man's prejudice. It was about the culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. He observed the crew's hesitation, the passengers' discomfort, and the pilot's brazen confidence. It was a stark reminder of how deeply rooted prejudice could be, even in a space meant to bring people together. The tension in the cabin grew thicker. Some passengers began to speak up in hushed tones, questioning why the flight attendant was being targeted. A woman seated near the front whispered to her companion, "She didn't do anything wrong. Why is he acting like this?" Another passenger, a young man in the middle rows, looked visibly angry but remained seated, unsure of how to act. Finally, a passenger in the back, a middle-aged black man, stood up. "This doesn't feel right," he said, his voice steady but firm. His words hung in the air, challenging the silence that had allowed the pilot to dominate. The pilot turned, momentarily startled, but quickly dismissed him with a condescending smile. "Sir, please take your seat. This doesn't concern you," he said. The passenger didn't budge. "It concerns all of us," he replied. "This isn't how people should be treated, and you know it." The flight attendant glanced at the man, her eyes briefly meeting his, and for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. The silence had been broken. The pilot's smirk faltered as murmurs spread through the cabin. More passengers began to shift uncomfortably, their whispers growing louder. The owner, still seated, took note of every reaction, every word. He knew the time to act was coming, but for now, he let the scene play out, allowing the pilot to reveal the full extent of his arrogance. What the pilot didn't realize was that he wasn't just facing a disgruntled passenger, he was about to face a reckoning that would turn his world upside down. The seeds of change were being planted, one act of courage at a time. The cabin was thick with tension as the pilot continued his tirade. His voice carried an air of finality, as though he believed his authority was unquestionable. The flight attendant stood her ground, her hands trembling slightly, but her face calm. She didn't speak, not because she couldn't, but because she knew any word would be twisted to suit the narrative he was already building against her. The passengers, once hesitant to act, were now visibly restless. The middle-aged black man who had spoken up earlier remained standing, his gaze unwavering as he watched the pilot. A few more murmurs rippled through the cabin, and some passengers shifted in their seats, their discomfort now more obvious. The balance of power in the room was beginning to shift, even if the pilot couldn't see it yet. Then, it happened. The airline owner, who had been silently observing from the back, finally rose from his seat. He moved with an air of calm authority, his steps deliberate. He didn't need to raise his voice. The simple act of standing up seemed to draw the attention of everyone in the cabin. All eyes turned to him as he walked down the aisle, his expression unreadable. The pilot, noticing the commotion, turned to face the approaching man. At first, he looked annoyed, as though he was being interrupted. But as the owner drew closer, something changed in his expression. Confusion flickered across his face, followed by a flash of recognition. He didn't know the man personally, but there was something in his demeanor, in the quiet confidence with which he moved, that unsettled him. The owner stopped a few feet away, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the pilot. The pilot hesitated, caught off guard. He stammered, This doesn't concern you, sir. It's an internal matter." The owner's lips curved into a slight smile, but his eyes remained sharp. "Oh, I think it does concern me. You see, I'm the owner of this airline, and I've been watching you for quite some time." The pilot's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, some visibly shocked, others barely containing their satisfaction at the sudden turn of events. The owner turned his gaze to the flight attendant, his voice softening. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." He then looked back at the pilot, his tone hardening. "You think this is acceptable behavior? To insult and demean one of my employees in front of passengers, to abuse your position of power?" The pilot stammered, I didn't mean." The owner cut him off. "Oh, you meant every word. You thought no one would challenge you, that no one would see. But I saw everything." The pilot looked around, as if searching for support, but found none. The crew stood silent, and the passengers stared at him with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disdain. The owner stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with authority. "You are no longer fit to represent this airline. Effective immediately, you're relieved of your duties. I suggest you leave this plane before I have security escort you out." The pilot's jaw dropped. He stammered a weak protest, but the owner's gaze didn't waver. Realizing he had no choice, the pilot finally turned and left, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As the pilot exited the plane, a wave of relief and quiet applause swept through the cabin. The owner turned back to the passengers and crew. "This airline stands for respect and dignity," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "If anyone ever sees behavior like this, speak up. We cannot let hate go unchallenged." He looked back at the flight attendant, giving her a nod of encouragement. "You did nothing wrong. Keep your head high." In that moment, the power dynamics of the cabin shifted entirely. The flight attendant smiled faintly, her confidence slowly returning. The passengers, once hesitant and silent, now saw the impact of standing up against injustice. This wasn't just about one man. It was a message that resonated deeply with everyone on board. The cabin settled into an unusual calm, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. The pilot, once so confident in his authority, had been humbled and removed, his prejudice exposed for all to see. The flight attendant, though shaken, stood a little taller. She had faced humiliation, but justice had been served in a way she hadn't expected. The airline owner addressed the cabin one last time, his words resonating deeply. "Hate and disrespect have no place here or anywhere. Today, we took a stand, but it's a reminder for all of us. Silence enables injustice. Let's be better." Passengers began to applaud, not out of obligation, but with genuine appreciation for what they had witnessed. The flight crew, once paralyzed by fear, now looked at their boss with newfound respect. It wasn't every day you saw someone in power use their position for good. As the flight attendant returned to her duties, she noticed the passengers' kindness, smiles, nods, even quiet words of encouragement. What began as a moment of humiliation had transformed into one of hope. The message was clear. Standing up against prejudice, even in small moments, can create ripples that change everything. If this story moved you, hit subscribe for more powerful stories and stay tuned for the next one. Please note this is not a real story. It's a work of fiction only for education and entertainment purposes.